You've gotten heat on all sides of this, but effectively you're saying that marijuana is not. Does not have the benefits that the world not only doesn't have the benefits, doesn't is actually much more dangerous than anybody thinks.
Well, I just bothered to read a report that came out 2 years ago from the National Academy of Medicine that nobody seemed to have bothered to read. The NAM is like the place for scientific research in the United States. They did a 500-page report that says basically nearly all the medical benefits are either unproven or don't exist, and that there's a true link to psychosis and schizophrenia, which are terrible diseases.
Okay, but we now have a number of states, obviously, that are legalizing it. More and more states that are legalizing it. We have companies that are, on the stock market.
Good luck with that.
Why do you say that?
Because the first time that there's a case of a really bad case of psychosis, I mean, there are really bad cases of psychosis linked to marijuana all the time. The first time some 28-year-old nurse throws her, kid off a roof, it's going to be the end of Tilray.
God, I can see the tweets coming in now. The pro marijuana people are just going to think they're going to think you're a throwback to reefer madness.
Well, if you talk to psychiatrists, the reason I wrote this book is because my wife, who is a forensic psychiatrist, said to me, I see so many cases of crimes where the person was using at the time, had been using for years, had become psychotic, had become schizophrenic. And I didn't really believe her. I think a lot of people don't believe this, that, if you haven't done the work, if you haven't done the research.
You make some good points in the book, too, because now I would never equate marijuana with heroin or coke or anything like that. But marijuana has enjoyed sort of this, it gets high times, man, the magazine and, hemp and dude. And so heroin and cocaine are still in this, area over here. And then marijuana is over here is harmless.
It's coffee. It's good for you. That's how it's sold.
And it was culturally, it was because of things like High Times and Cheech and Chong
and counterculture.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's fine, but like it's a drug. Okay, it's an intoxicant, and
so is alcohol.
So is alcohol, absolutely. But alcohol causes violence. We all know it does. And frankly, there probably should be higher taxes and stronger warning labels on alcohol. But if this stuff is going to be legally sold, I can promise you the companies are going to have to put warning labels on it.
Alex, just to put a finer point on it, you were one of those people who thought this was fine before you really did the research,
That's right. I had really no view on legalization. And I was sort of Andrew can tell you, I was sort of a libertarian on drug policy. People should make their own mistakes.
We used to have these conversations all the time.
Yeah, and Andrew was right, and I was wrong. That's the fact of it. Listen.
Wait a second.
People can be. I know.
I've never seen that. About what? What was he saying?
Well, he said that the risks here are more serious than people realize. And by the way, I don't think that people should go to jail for possessing or using cannabis.
Right.
We're not going to put 40 million people in jail. The question is, should they know what the risks are, and should we have like a big advertising campaign, a tobacco-style advertising campaign that says this is real?
Okay, so here's the issue, though. There's a lot of money right now, obviously, on the line, and people behind pushing legalization of cannabis.
Yes.
How many people and how much money is on the other side of this debate?
Very, very little. There's a small group called Smarter Approaches to Marijuana. The thing is, the people who are concerned with drug abuse generally, there's the National Institute on Drug Abuse. They're worried about opioids right now because opioids are killing so many people. So this is really...
Well, Alex, I'll tell you what you need to make clear. It's the first thing I asked you. And what's the incidence versus placebo? Because most people... I went to school in Boulder, okay? So I never had a psychotic episode, although it was a while ago. It wasn't nearly as strong, obviously. But not everyone is going to identify with a psychotic incident because they're going to say, I smoked pot for a long time and nothing ever happened. What's the increased incidence over...
So if you start using in your teens, you probably have about a 3x...
3 times?
Yes.
A low number? Or
3 times a low number, but there's also going to be cases of temporary psychosis, and that's very common. So in other words, not that I'm becoming permanently mentally ill from this, but all those people who wind up in the ER from smoking, they're basically psychotic.
How much of this, though, you think is age-related? Meaning, if you said, okay, you can't use marijuana until you're 25 or 30 even, would that change the...
Do you think that's going to work as a regulatory policy?
I don't, but I'm just asking the question based on the research that you've done, because it seems like most of it seems to be focused on this, the sort of under 25-year-old...
Any drug is less
stopping by the time. You start when you're 15, you stop when you're 30, Andrew.
Right. If you haven't stopped by the time you're 30, you probably have a real problem if you're using frequently.
Okay.
So, I mean, with the drug, not
in the old
disease.
days. Okay.
The trend of legalizing recreational marijuana is on the rise. New York and New Jersey are two of the latest states considering legalizing it. But public opinion on pot has changed drastically over the last 20 years. More people support legalizing it now more than ever before. But is marijuana as harmless as most people think? Here to break down the facts is Alex Berenson, a former New York Times reporter and the author of the new book. It comes out tomorrow. You can pre-order it today. It's called Tell Your Children: The Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. Alex, good morning to you.
Thanks for having me on, Steve.
In the New York Times, they've got an article on this, and the headline is, "What Advocates of Legalizing Pot Don't Want You to Know."
Yes, I can tell you that's a very good article because I wrote it. So pot has been, or I like to call it marijuana or cannabis. I like to take it seriously. But advocates for cannabis have said for really 20 years, this is a harmless substance. No one should go to jail for growing it, for trafficking it, because it's not dangerous. And that's just not true.
How is it dangerous?
It's really neurotoxic. People say you
What does that mean?
It means it's bad for your brain. That's a fancy way of saying it's bad for your brain. There are very good studies showing that it's linked to psychosis, which is a break from reality, from schizophrenia, and those conditions can cause violence.
About 20 years ago, it seems like there have been advocates across the country trying to introduce it as a more mainstream thing, that it's not so bad, don't worry about it. Who are those people?
Well, honestly, it's a lot of the elite media that's bought into this. The number one group that's encouraged legalization in the last 20 years is the Drug Policy Alliance, which is a well-funded group. Actually, George Soros is its largest backer. And this has become, it's really become a Democratic issue, although some Republicans now support legalization too. And I think that lost in the partisanship here has been the fact that the science has gone the other way. The science in the last 20 years has shown that cannabis is dangerous.
We've got some statistics to show the folks at home. Pot users who are high while driving, 69% of pot users said they'd driven high at least once in the past year. 27% of all users said they drive stoned almost daily, which is terrifying. 10% of all users think it makes them a better driver. Why is it that in the past advocates have overstated the how unimpacted you're going to be?
I think a lot of people don't know what the statistics really are. You have to read the studies, you have to read the science. When I spent, more than a year writing this book. My wife is a forensic psychiatrist. She's a doctor who specializes in dealing with the criminally mentally ill, and she's the one who said, you need to write this book. You used to be a journalist, you have credibility, you should write, you should really look at this. And the more I read, the more I realized how serious an issue this is. But if you don't do the work, and you just, watch Seth Rogen getting stoned, and you think it's funny.
Yeah. Meanwhile, across the country, states, it seems like one by one are putting it on their ballots whether or not they should legalize it. 10 states have legalized recreational marijuana. 33 have legalized medical marijuana. Now, you're not here to take a stand on whether or not marijuana is right or not. You're just out to tell people, look, it's dangerous.
Yes. Yeah. Listen, alcohol is dangerous, too. You drink too much, bad things can happen. You can get in car accidents. You can get in fights. Alcohol's legal. But we know alcohol can be dangerous, and we don't let people drink and drive. We need to tell people the real risks of marijuana, and we need to have a reasonable regulatory scheme, whether that means that we're going to have a lot of taxes on it, and I realize that's a dirty word here, but if we're going to discourage its use one way or another, if we're going to have criminal penalties for trafficking and dealing of it, we just can't say, hey, this is fine, everybody should smoke, it's harmless, because that is not true.
We have heard that, we're going to legalize pot and the state's going to get a whole bunch of tax money. How's that working out?
There's some tax revenue, but it's much less than people realize. In Colorado, which is the state that has...
Does it outweigh the public safety risk?
I don't think so. In Colorado, less than 1% of the state budget is cannabis-related taxes. And violent crime is soaring in the states that legalized. Cory Booker said when he introduced a federal legalization bill that violent crime was falling, and that was not true. Booker was wrong, and no one called him on it because no one knows. But the fact is that aggravated assault and murders are soaring in the 4 states that legalized first.
Well, you just called him out. Let's see if he responds. It's an eye-opening book. It comes out tomorrow. It's called Tell Your Children: The Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. Alex Berenson, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on.
Good work.
Our next guest made a lot of news this week for his new book detailing the harmful effects of marijuana, but he's drawn a lot of heat, too, with critics saying things like this. Tell your children that Alex Berenson is full of it. Alex Berenson is a little too eager to prove that weed makes people crazy. And new book resurrects long disproven myths about marijuana.
But is that all just a bunch of smoke? Here to respond, Alex Berenson, former New York Times reporter and author of the new book, Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. Alex, I want you to respond to those attacks. But first, just quickly, why did you write the book and what did you find?
Well, I wrote the book because I want parents and kids to be able to have an informed conversation about this. This drug is being presented as medicine and harmless and natural by a lot of people who have a financial interest in selling it, and by drug policy organizations that want full national legalization. That's just not true. The science does not support that. The science shows that there's a lot of potential harms with cannabis, especially if you start smoking as a teenager, especially if you use heavily. The people who are, and I want parents to know that, and I want teenagers and young adults to know that, because use is rising.
Right. So here's what filtermag.org wrote about, and I want to get your reaction after. Critics have questioned why the author chose to use data from 2014 as the baseline for changes in homicide rates, even though Oregon saw both weed legalization and a homicide uptick. In 2014, the state's homicide rate drastically dropped between 2016 to 2017.
So I did this in the simplest, most intellectually honest possible way. 2013 was the last year before recreational legalization in Colorado and Washington, which are the two biggest states. Then there's Oregon and Alaska. Put them all together. Look at murders and aggravated assaults in 2013. Look at murders and aggravated assaults in 2017, which is the most recent data that we have. See if all four states have gone up, gone down, gone sideways. It turns out that murders and aggravated assaults have gone up substantially more than the national average.
And that's significant because the legalization crowd, which is very powerful, has promised that these kinds of things would go down.
That's right. The idea was you're going to end the black market, which turns out not to be true at all, and you're going to give police a chance to focus on things other than pot smokers.
Right.
But it turns out that for whatever reason, and we need to figure out why, but in some cases there's a clear connection to cannabis use, that these crimes are rising right now.
Alex, let me show you this from Reason.com. It says, Berenson quotes a 2017 report from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Cannabis use is likely to increase the risk of schizophrenia and other psychoses. The higher the use, the greater the risk. It overstates what NASEM's research review found. Your reaction?
Well, I'm not sure how it overstates it. That's what they found. It's in black and white. It is the first finding in Chapter 12 of their 500-page report, which they took a year to put together, on the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids. Now, I didn't make it up. It's in there. It is the first sentence in the chapter on cannabis and mental health. So you can judge for yourself. Did I overstate that? I said what they said.
Okay, well, I was going to say, your critics say that you're a prohibitionist. So what would you say to that?
I'm not a prohibitionist. 40 million people used cannabis in 2017 in the United States. We're not going to put them all in jail. I think full national legalization is a mistake. It creates a community of a business community that's going to promote use of this drug. I think we can get to a compromise of decriminalization where if you're using or possessing cannabis, you're not going to go to jail. Mostly that's true now, but we can explicitly say it nationally. That would be fine. But prohibitionist is a meaningless term.
So, Alex, what is your message? Both Rachel and I have kids that are of the pot smoking age. What's your message to those youngsters?
The most important thing you can do is delay. If you're going to use this stuff, you probably do not use it until you're in your 20s when your brain has matured more fully. And don't fall for the myth that it's less dangerous than alcohol. It's less dangerous in some ways than alcohol. It's more dangerous in other ways than alcohol. It's more neurotoxic than alcohol.
Well, this is the book, and these are the arguments. So if you're going to have conversations with your kids, and you should be, arm yourself with some information. Thank you.
Thanks.
Alex, thanks very much.
Thanks.
Autumn presents
Department of Public Health,
published in the print issue of The New Yorker with the headline, Unwatched Pot. Written by Malcolm Gladwell. Read by Eduardo Ballerini. A few years ago, the National Academy of Medicine convened a panel of 16 leading medical experts to analyze the scientific literature on cannabis. The report they prepared, which came out in January of 2017, runs to 468 pages. It contains no bombshells or surprises, which perhaps explains why it went largely unnoticed. It simply stated, over and over again, that a drug North Americans have become enthusiastic about remains a mystery. For example, smoking pot is widely supposed to diminish the nausea associated with chemotherapy. But, the panel pointed out, there are no good-quality randomized trials investigating this option. We have evidence for marijuana as a treatment for pain, but very little is known about the efficacy, dose, routes of administration, or side effects of commonly used and commercially available cannabis products in the United States. The caveats continue. Is it good for epilepsy? Insufficient evidence. Tourette syndrome? Limited evidence. ALS, Huntington's, and Parkinson's? Insufficient evidence. Irritable bowel syndrome? Insufficient evidence. Dementia and glaucoma? Probably not. Anxiety? Maybe. Depression? Probably not. Then come chapters 5 through 13, the heart of the report, which concern marijuana's potential risks. The haze of uncertainty continues. Does the use of cannabis increase the likelihood of fatal car accidents? Yes. By how much? Unclear. Does it affect motivation and cognition? Hard to say, but probably. Does it affect employment prospects? Probably. Will it impair academic achievement? Limited evidence. This goes on for pages. We need proper studies, the panel concluded, on the health effects of cannabis on children and teenagers and pregnant women and breastfeeding mothers and older populations and heavy cannabis users. In other words, on everyone except the college student who smokes a joint once a month. The panel also called for investigation into the pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic properties of cannabis, modes of delivery, different concentrations in various populations, including the dose-response relationships of cannabis and THC or other cannabinoids. Figuring out the dose-response relationship of a new compound is something a pharmaceutical company does from the start of trials in human subjects, as it prepares a new drug application for the FDA. Too little of a powerful drug means that it won't work. Too much means that it might do more harm than good. The amount of active ingredient in a pill and the metabolic path that the ingredient takes after it enters your body, these are things that drug makers will have painstakingly mapped out before the product comes on the market, with a tractor-trailer full of supporting documentation. With marijuana, apparently, we're still waiting for this information. It's hard to study a substance that until very recently has been almost universally illegal. And the few studies we do have were done mostly in the 1980s and 90s, when cannabis was not nearly as potent as it is now. Because of recent developments in plant breeding and growing techniques, the typical concentration of THC, the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana, has gone from the low single digits to more than 20%, from a swig of near beer to a tequila shot. Are users smoking less to compensate for the drug's new potency, or simply getting more stoned more quickly? Is high-potency cannabis more of a problem for younger users or for older ones? For some drugs, the dose-response curve is linear. Twice the dose creates twice the effect. For other drugs, it's nonlinear. Twice the dose can increase the effect tenfold, or hardly at all, which is true for cannabis. It also matters, of course, how cannabis is consumed. It can be smoked, vaped, eaten, or applied to the skin. How are absorption patterns affected? Last May, not long before Canada legalized the recreational use of marijuana, Beau Kilmer, a drug policy expert with the Rand Corporation, testified before the Canadian Parliament. He warned that the fastest-growing segment of the legal market in Washington state was extracts for inhalation, and that the mean THC concentration for those products was more than 65%. We know little about the health consequences, risks, and benefits of many of the cannabis products likely to be sold in non-medical markets, he said. Nor did we know how higher potency products would affect THC consumption. When it comes to cannabis, the best-case scenario is that we will muddle through, learning more about its true effects as we go along and adapting as needed, the way, say, the once extraordinarily lethal innovation of the automobile has been gradually tamed in the course of its history. For those curious about the worst-case scenario, Alex Berenson has written a short manifesto. Tell your children the truth about marijuana, mental illness, and violence. Berenson begins his book with an account of a conversation he had with his wife, a psychiatrist who specializes in treating mentally ill criminals. They were discussing one of the many grim cases that cross her desk, the usual horror story, someone who'd cut up his grandmother or set fire to his apartment. Then his wife said something like, "Of course, he was high, been smoking pot his whole life." "Of course," I said. "Yeah, they all smoke." "Well, other things too, right?" "Sometimes, but they all smoke." Berenson used to be an investigative reporter for The Times, where he covered, among other things, healthcare and the pharmaceutical industry. Then he left the paper to write a popular series of thrillers. At the time of his conversation with his wife, he had the typical layman's view of cannabis, which is that it's largely benign. His wife's remark alarmed him, and he set out to educate himself. Berenson is constrained by the same problem the National Academy of Medicine faced, that when it comes to marijuana, we really don't know very much. But he has a reporter's tenacity, a novelist's imagination, and an outsider's knack for asking intemperate questions. The result is disturbing. The first of Berenson's questions concerns what has long been the most worrisome point about cannabis, its association with mental illness. Many people with serious psychiatric illness smoke lots of pot. The marijuana lobby typically responds to this fact by saying that pot smoking is a response to mental illness, not the cause of it. That people with psychiatric issues use marijuana to self-medicate. That is only partly true. In some cases, heavy cannabis use does seem to cause mental illness. As the National Academy panel declared in one of its few unequivocal conclusions, cannabis use is likely to increase the risk of developing schizophrenia and other psychoses. The higher the use, the greater the risk. Berenson thinks that we are far too sanguine about this link. He wonders how large the risk is and what might be behind it. In one of the most fascinating sections of Tell Your Children, he sits down with Eric Messamore, a psychiatrist who specializes in neuropharmacology and in the treatment of schizophrenia. Messamore reports that, following the recent rise in marijuana use in the U.S., it has almost doubled in the past 2 decades, not necessarily as the result of legal reforms. He has begun to see a new kind of patient, older, and not from the marginalized communities that his patients usually come from. These are otherwise stable, middle-class professionals. Berenson writes, a surprising number of them seem to have used only cannabis and no other drugs before their breaks. The disease they developed looked like schizophrenia, but it had developed later, and their prognosis seemed to be worse. Their delusions and paranoia hardly responded to antipsychotics. Messamore theorizes that THC may interfere with the brain's anti-inflammatory mechanisms, resulting in damage to nerve cells and blood vessels. Is this the reason, Berenson wonders, for the rising incidence of schizophrenia in the developed world, where cannabis use has also increased? In the northern parts of Finland, incidence of the disease has nearly doubled since 1993. In Denmark, cases have risen 25% since 2000. In the United States, hospital emergency rooms have seen a 50% increase in schizophrenia admissions since 2006. If you include cases where schizophrenia was a secondary diagnosis, annual admissions in the past decade have increased from 1.26 million to 2.1 million. Berenson's second question derives from the first. The delusions and paranoia that often accompany psychoses can sometimes trigger violent behavior. If cannabis is implicated in a rise in psychoses, should we expect the increased use of marijuana to be accompanied by a rise in violent crime, as Berenson's wife suggested? Once again, there is no definitive answer, so Berenson has collected bits and pieces of evidence. For example, In a 2013 paper in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, researchers looked at the results of a survey of more than 12,000 American high school students. The authors assumed that alcohol use among students would be a predictor of violent behavior, and that marijuana use would predict the opposite. In fact, those who used only marijuana were 3 times more likely to be physically aggressive than abstainers were. Those who used only alcohol were 2.7 times more likely to be aggressive. Observational studies like these don't establish causation, but they invite the sort of research that could. Berenson looks, too, at the early results from the state of Washington, which in 2014 became the first U.S. jurisdiction to legalize recreational marijuana. Between 2013 and 2017, the state's murder and aggravated assault rates rose 40%, twice the national homicide increase and 4 times the national aggravated assault increase. We don't know that an increase in cannabis use was responsible for that surge in violence. Berenson, though, finds it strange that at a time when Washington may have exposed its population to higher levels of what is widely assumed to be a calming substance, its citizens began turning on one another with increased aggression. His third question is whether cannabis serves as a gateway drug. There are 2 possibilities. The first is that marijuana activates certain behavioral and neurological pathways that ease the onset of more serious addictions. The second possibility is that marijuana offers a safer alternative to other drugs. That if you start smoking pot to deal with chronic pain, you never graduate to opioids. Which is it? This is a very hard question to answer. We're only a decade or so into the widespread recreational use of high-potency marijuana. Maybe cannabis opens the door to other drugs, but only after prolonged use. Or maybe the low-potency marijuana of years past wasn't a gateway, but today's high-potency marijuana is. Methodologically, Berenson points out, the issue is complicated by the fact that the first wave of marijuana legalization took place on the West Coast, while the first serious wave of opioid addiction took place in the middle of the country. So if all you do is eyeball the numbers, it looks as if opioid overdoses are lowest in cannabis states and highest in non-cannabis states. Not surprisingly, the data we have are messy. Berenson, in his role as devil's advocate, emphasizes the research that sees cannabis as opening the door to opioid use. For example, 2 studies of identical twins in the Netherlands and in Australia show that in cases where one twin used cannabis before the age of 17 and the other didn't, the cannabis user was several times more likely to develop an addiction to opioids. Berenson also enlists a statistician at NYU to help him sort through state-level overdose data, and what he finds is not encouraging. States where more people used cannabis tended to have more overdoses. The National Academy panel is more judicious. Its conclusion is that we simply don't know enough, because there haven't been any systematic studies. But the panel's uncertainty is scarcely more reassuring than Berenson's alarmism. 72,000 Americans died in 2017 of drug overdoses. Should you embark on a pro-cannabis crusade without knowing whether it will add to or subtract from that number? Drug policy is always clearest at the fringes. Illegal opioids are at one end. They are dangerous. Manufacturers and distributors belong in prison, and users belong in drug treatment programs. The cannabis industry would have us believe that its product, like coffee, belongs at the other end of the continuum. Flocana partners with independent, multi-generational farmers who cultivate under full sun sustainably and in small batches. The promotional literature for one California cannabis brand reads, "Using only organic methods, these stewards of the land have spent their lives balancing a unique and harmonious relationship between the farm, the genetics, and the terroir." But cannabis is not coffee. It's somewhere in the middle. The experience of most users is relatively benign and predictable. The experience of a few at the margins is not. Products or behaviors that have that kind of muddled risk profile are confusing because it is very difficult for those in the benign middle to appreciate the experiences of those at the statistical tails. Low-frequency risks also take longer and are far harder to quantify, and the lesson of Tell Your Children and the National Academy report is that we aren't yet in a position to do so. For the moment, cannabis probably belongs in the category of substances that society permits, but simultaneously discourages. Cigarettes are heavily taxed, and smoking is prohibited in most workplaces and public spaces. Alcohol can't be sold without a license and is kept out of the hands of children. Prescription drugs have rules about dosages, labels that describe their risks, and policies that govern their availability. The advice that seasoned potheads sometimes give new users, start low and go slow, is probably good advice for society as a whole, at least until we better understand what we are dealing with. Late last year, the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, Scott Gottlieb, announced a federal crackdown on e-cigarettes. He had seen the data on soaring use among teenagers, and he said, "It shocked my conscience." He announced that the FDA would ban many kinds of flavored e-cigarettes, which are especially popular with teens, and would restrict the retail outlets where e-cigarettes were available. In the dozen years since e-cigarettes were introduced into the marketplace, they've attracted an enormous amount of attention. There are scores of studies and papers on the subject in the medical and legal literature, grappling with the questions raised by the new technology. Vaping is clearly popular among kids. Is it a gateway to traditional tobacco use? Some public health experts worry that we're grooming a younger generation for a lifetime of dangerous addiction. Yet other people see e-cigarettes as a much safer alternative for adult smokers looking to satisfy their nicotine addiction. That's the British perspective. Last year, a parliamentary committee recommended cutting taxes on e-cigarettes and allowing vaping in areas where it had previously been banned. Since e-cigarettes are as much as 95% less harmful than regular cigarettes, the committee argued, why not promote them? Gottlieb said that he was splitting the difference between the two positions, giving adults opportunities to transition to non-combustible products while upholding the FDA's solemn mandate to make nicotine products less accessible and less appealing to children. He was immediately criticized. Somehow, we have completely lost all sense of public health perspective, Michael Siegel, a public health researcher at Boston University, wrote after the FDA announcement. Every argument that the FDA is making in justifying a ban on the sale of electronic cigarettes in convenience stores and gas stations applies even more strongly for real tobacco cigarettes. You know, the ones that kill hundreds of thousands of Americans each year? Something is terribly wrong with our sense of perspective when we take the e-cigarettes off the shelf but allow the old-fashioned ones to remain. Among members of the public health community, it is impossible to spend 5 minutes on the e-cigarette question without getting into an argument. And this is nicotine they are arguing about, a drug that has been exhaustively studied by generations of scientists. We don't worry that e-cigarettes increase the number of fatal car accidents, diminish motivation and cognition, or impair academic achievement. The drugs through the gateway that we worry about with e-cigarettes are Marlboros, not opioids. There are no enormous scientific question marks over nicotine's dosing and bioavailability. Yet we still proceed cautiously and carefully with nicotine, because it is a powerful drug. And when powerful drugs are consumed by lots of people in new and untested ways, we have an obligation to try to figure out what will happen. A week after Gottlieb announced his crackdown on e-cigarettes, on the ground that they are too enticing to children, Siegel visited the first recreational marijuana facility in Massachusetts. Here is what he found on the menu, each offering laced with large amounts of a drug, THC, that no one knows much about. Strawberry-flavored chewy bites, large citrus gummy bears, delectable Belgian dark chocolate bars, assorted fruit-flavored chews, assorted fruit-flavored cubes, raspberry-flavored confection, raspberry-flavored lozenges, chewy cocoa caramel bite-sized treats, raspberry and watermelon-flavored lozenges, chocolate chip brownies. He concludes, "This is public health in 2018?